Before we start today's show, I just wanted to mention our sponsor, Money Farm. Now, Money Farm is a leading digital wealth manager with over 60,000 active investors and over £2 billion invested on its platform. It offers 3 investment products, including a stocks and shares ISA, a general investment account, and a personal pension. And by answering a few simple questions about your investment goals and attitude to risk, you'll be matched to one of 7 globally diversified portfolios. Money Farm's expert team provides hands-on investment management by regularly adjusting and rebalancing your portfolio on your behalf. You'll even get a dedicated investment consultant should you want to widen your investment plans, something that sets it apart from most of its competitors. The minimum investment amount is £500 and fees range between 0.35% and 0.75% a year, depending on the amount you have invested. Money to the Masses listeners can take advantage of a special offer where Money Farm will run your money fee-free for a year. Head to moneytothemasses.com and search Money Farm for more information.
Hello and welcome to episode 343 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay. And this week we're going to conclude our 2-part special where we're covering the house buying process, because there are many of us here at Money to the Masses who have recently experienced both the good and bad side of selling and buying houses. So why not do that as a special? So Damien, welcome back to the show. We're here for part 2 of the house buying special.
Yeah, and it's quite nice to do something different because we've never done a 2-part special, I think I'm right in saying, ever on any particular topic. So if you're listening to this show, then just to reiterate, last week we spoke about the first half of the house buying process. So that means from the moment you might have an inkling that at some point in the future you might want to move, then that will be about preparing your finances, what you need to do ahead of actually trying to find a house, all the way up to the point where you maybe make an offer on your dream house. Then what we're doing this week, we're dealing with how you sell your own house and the bit that goes after that up to exchange and then finally completion when you move. So we're going to cover all that. And what we're going to do is we're going to bring different members of the team in and out of the podcast as we go along, because we've all, between us, had a variety of experiences in a very short space of time, because in the last, I'd say, 18 months, pretty much every person in the Money to the Masses office has either moved house, in the process of moving house, or sold another property. So what we're going to do at the early part of the podcast, we're actually going to have Harvey on board, because we're going to be talking about selling your own house and what you do in the lead up to that.
Okay, so let's crack on with the pod then. And we're going to be welcoming Harvey to the show this week. And we're going to be talking about selling houses. So let me just get it right, Harvey. Are we talking about a house that you've recently sold or you're selling?
Hi, Andy. Thanks for having me on. No, actually, I haven't sold property of my own, but I have been involved with helping a family member sell a property that was being rented out. So I can add some bits of information that might be helpful to our listeners.
So that is interesting because Harvey's got a different angle. So there's somebody renting a property and they're obviously trying to sell that house. From my angle, I was living in the house and I'm trying to sell it. But Andy, you've got some past experience of selling a house, which was slightly different to everybody else because you did it directly, didn't you?
Yeah, so when we moved from our small flat into what is now our family home, we had a period in which we moved areas, so we needed to rent. But similarly, we needed to rent out our old place while we kind of worked out what we were doing. And as it transpired, as the years went on, we liked the person who was renting our property. And so we just ended up selling to them. So we kind of cut out the middleman in the end and sold direct. Don't know whether that was the right thing to do. Not sure we got the absolute price we could have got had we used an agent, but that's what we did.
So we'll come on to that in a bit, because we are going to talk about how you sell your house, whether you use an online agent, an agent that's from the high street, a typical old style way of doing it. And actually, Andy, who sold it directly, we seem to cover nearly every base in the Money to the Masses offices. That wasn't deliberate, but it does make for a better podcast. So Harvey, can I just ask then, for you, the house you were selling had somebody that was in there renting. So what was the process where they decided they needed to sell the house to actually getting it to a point where it was on the market? What did you have to do?
So the process began with just trying to decipher how to give notice to the tenants. As you know, with the pandemic and with changed rules around tenancies, we had to allow up to 6 months for the tenant to vacate the property so that it could be prepared and, we could get it ready for being sold. So that in itself meant that we had to get our skates on, give notice. We sort of hoped that the tenants would move quickly, but, the contract said a month's notice. Eventually it took 3 months for the tenants to leave the property, which, was better than we expected. But we had to allow for that larger window for the property to be vacated.
So if we're at the point now then, Harvey, where the property is empty, what did you do to get it ready to get it on the market?
It's quite interesting because in a lot of ways, when you're selling a property of your own, you know the problems within your own house, because you live in it, you know what things need perhaps fixing, you know what things other people might notice when they come into your home. But when a property is being let out, you don't necessarily know what you're going to discover. So the first part of that was really just discovering what needed to be done. And from my point of view, it was just going and doing an assessment and seeing whether the property needed any big work doing. And really, for the property that we were dealing with, it was the outside areas. So the garden was completely overgrown. We couldn't get past through the shrubbery and things because the people that had lived there just obviously hadn't used the garden and it had become quite overgrown. And there were a few things around the house. So, we knew that it needed a lick of paint. I did have to encourage my family member not to do things like change the bathroom or change the kitchen because I just really didn't see the value in doing those things. I think I've said to you before, Damien, when I sold my own house, we put in new windows. We did quite a lot of work to the house in order to get it ready for market. And actually, after we sold it, we drove past the house and realised they'd ripped all the windows out anyway. They weren't obviously to the liking of the people that bought it. So some past experience and some learning that we did with selling our own property a few years back helped us this time around. So I was able to give some advice as to not doing those big jobs that people generally want to come in and put their own stamp on a property, especially when it's a family home and you can see how people would want to perhaps even knock down walls. There was a lot of partitioning in the house, so we could see how somebody might want to come in and actually make it a more open plan living space. So yeah, there was a lot of assessment to just see what work would add value and what work was really just going to cost money and perhaps not gain anything in the selling process.
Going on from that, Harvey, I was different to you. So just overlaying my own experience there, when I was thinking about potentially selling my house, I did speak to a few people in the industry who were estate agents and said, is it worth me doing the kitchen and bathroom? And almost universally, they said, no, don't bother, because what you've just described, I've never heard it with windows, but I've heard it with other things where they say that people tend to go in and then just rip out what's there and put in their own taste and style. The flip side was, because of my scenario, I didn't know whether I would ultimately stay in the house, because the move was in a balance whether I would actually it would end up happening or not. And I was trying to be as flexible as I could. So we ended up, as I mentioned last week on the podcast, borrowing money to do the kitchen and bathroom because we realised that we could potentially stay there. But we were shrewd enough to go with contemporary styles that we knew that were very in fashion at that point. And I can't really put a picture online, but people would know what a freestanding bath was, what my bathroom looked like. To this day, I think that's what sold our house in the end, because when people went in, they saw it. Well, my wife says that's what sold the house. I like to think it was my about 2 weeks of solid paintwork, doing everything up in the house, because what I did in the lead up as well is we did the kitchen and bathroom. That was about 18 months, 2 years prior. We did that over a period of time, which therefore did mean that we could get top whack for our house at the top end of the price bracket. But it also meant that if we weren't going to move, we were able to enjoy the new kitchen and bathroom. Bearing in mind, I lived there for 12 years and hadn't done anything. So you can imagine the state of my kitchen and bathroom. I won't be sharing pictures of that, to be honest with you, because the doors were falling off. But we actually at the point where I then, ahead of my move, went round and just did the whole lick of paint. And fortunately, I just repainted the rooms with the colours that I already had. So it was really, a lot of it was touching up, because it'd been decorated in the last 5 years anyway, and I wasn't too tired or anything like that. So I went round and did all the repairs, the real overdue repairs, the things that people would be looking at when you moved in. It did mean getting a few people in to do some work for some workmen, to get bits and pieces done, things that were repairs that are beyond my very low skill level when it comes to DIY. But it was all trying to keep it within a budget. And that way, when people go in, you're trying to give them that showroom kind of effect. And the other big thing that I would say was just decluttering. Now, Liam, who writes a lot of our property articles, he's got a real bee in his bonnet about this kind of stuff. We're going to put the link in the show notes to some of the tips. But one of the biggest tips was declutter. Now, I've got 2 children, and as anyone who listens to this podcast and all the Money to Masses team who mostly have at least one child, when you have children, especially young children, the amount of like mess and clutter and stuff like that. So we hired one of those yellow storage places and just took a load of stuff up there and put it in there for, I mean, you get a really good deal on some of those. They're always giving you like half price deals. And we put in things like dining room chairs to make the dining room table look a bit better. So rather than having 6 chairs, we had 4. We put a load of the kids' toys up there. And so pretty much completely decluttered. It made it look like almost a show home. It was a bit hard because there were things like you'd go and try and find, where's such and such? And then you realise that you've probably sent the TV remote up into the storage unit and all things like that. So it definitely had a positive impact because ultimately the people who bought my house weren't the same stage of life as us. For example, they were a couple that didn't have children, and that means that they might not be able to see beyond all that clutter. And so they were looking at the house in a very different way, basically like how my wife and I saw it when we first bought it, as a sort of home for us to have people in and entertain, not as a place like we were living in, as a family home there where you've got like stuff everywhere. So one of my big tips was that, and of course that had a massive impact when it came to taking the photos. So we'll come on to that now actually, about how you picked agents. And we're going to bring Laura onto the show later because she has an experience of dealing with online agents versus high street agents. Now, I've only ever used a high street agent to sell a house, whereas Laura's used both. So I would like to hear her view on which is best in experience. But one of the things that I did do when we picked an agent to sell our house was pick the one that took the best photos. So we looked at the ones that had the highest prices. That's always going to suck you in. They always do that, try and overvalue. But I knew how much my house was worth, so I wasn't going to get too sucked in about the valuation. And I thought they were overvaluing it when they put it on the market. And actually, they turned out to be right in terms of their valuation. But they had the best pictures, and it actually meant that we got a lot of interest, initially at least, in terms of viewings. And so that was one of the big positives. I don't know about you, Harvey, when you were selling a property that is an ex-rental and you haven't done much work to it, I mean, how did you pick your agent? Did you not care? Was it a case you just wanted speed rather than price? How did that work?
It's quite different, to be honest, Damien, because I think that part of what you've described there is understanding who's going to buy your house and just understanding what prospective buyer might look like and what they're looking for in your property. The house that I was dealing with was in a rural setting. So in a rural setting, generally people want to go along and see the property rather than just look at it online. And because people that are buying it are generally in the vicinity of the property, they're not too far away, then they're not inclined so much to be online. So I kind of knew that we were going to go with one of the high street agents. But interestingly, when you look at photographs, and what we did was, as part of preparing the house, we emptied it of all the furniture. So a lot of the furniture was really run down and we didn't want it to be in the photographs anyway. And it was really sparse, so it didn't give that homely feel. So we got rid of all the furniture. But then what the agent pointed out to us was that there was nothing to indicate scale on a photograph. So when you've got an armchair or a sofa or a bookshelf or a TV, a bed in a room, you can kind of see how much floor space there is around that piece of furniture. But actually, in a house where you have no furniture, there's no sort of scale to indicate the size of the room so that people looking online can get an idea of how big the rooms are. So we kept having to move like plant pots around, and we kept having to move this random chair around just that it didn't look too strange. Yeah, that was definitely one of the first times I'd had to deal with that aspect of it, because when we'd sold our family home previously, we'd done exactly the same as what you've done. You know, we'd decluttered, made it look very show-homey, so that people could see themselves living in it, with lots of floor space showing, so that there's, you know, that people can kind of see themselves living in the space that you're trying to sell. But it was a learning experience this time around.
I tell you, one of the biggest things we did, we over decluttered, if that can make sense. So when the guy came around and took the photos, he actually in the end said, like, "Where's your coffee machine gone?" Because we got rid of the coffee machine and everything. But of course, that's the thing, that people want to see themselves in the house, and so he made us go and get some of the stuff back and put it in there to make it look like it was being lived in and it wasn't just this show home. And so there was even like flowers that we had in the house. We never have flowers, but we did for our photos, and like the sort of bottle of wine. It just made it look like something from a catalogue. It was almost, you feel a bit ridiculous with it, but it makes a massive difference because that's going to get people at least interested to come and maybe have a look. And as you said, Harv, I hadn't thought about the scale issue with furniture, but I think it's a very good point. But equally, you can do the other way around where you can make things look bigger. So you could take, for example, say there's a desk in your children's bedroom that they might be working at. Now, we kept taking the desk out of the bedroom when they were taking photos, shifting some of the furniture, just because we still needed the stuff in there because we're living in the house. My daughter's still got to do her homework. But as the photographer is taking the pictures, there's nothing to stop you moving things around to give a good sense of perspective and space. And that is largely down to the person taking the pictures, which is why I go back and say, look at the people who do the best pictures, and then let that also be one of your deciding factors, not just about cost, not just about who gets the highest asking price and those sorts of things. That is one of the things that goes into the mix. I don't think it's always chance. If you look online and you look at the pictures of the houses that just seem to be hanging around online. Yes, sometimes the house might not be in everybody's taste, but sometimes they also have the worst pictures, like really dark, really dingy, because they can do a lot of the stuff in the post-edit as well. I mean, when you looked at the pictures on my house, it was the sunniest day ever. It wasn't the day you took the pictures. I know I was there, but they edit so everyone has this like, it's almost like the Teletubby sky, you know, that really big blue sky. It looked like that. And so they can improve things and lighten it. So I think it's how much they want to sell your house. But how much did cost come into it? Because one of the things we obviously negotiated quite hard on the costs for the agent. So we got the agent come in, and they are expensive, let's be honest, because they will be charging anything like 1% on the property value. So if you depend on your property, we're talking thousands. So if you go for an online agent, you could maybe sell a house for a couple of grand, whereas you could end up be paying 5, 6, 7, 8 grand to sell the same house, but doing it through an online agent. So we negotiated hard on a tiered structure to encourage them to try and get the biggest price for the house. And I mean, they were accepting of that. That is pretty much par for the course. I mean, for you or the person that was actually selling, how much was cost part of the driver?
Cost was a large part of the driver, largely because, you know, they bought a property that had cost them more going forwards, and they needed to take that money out of the property. So there was definitely a goal set at the beginning of the process in terms of how much, you know, we wanted to sell the house for. And then you've got to put all those costs in there so that you can work out, you know, what you come out with at the end. What we did was we realized it's an expensive area for agents. There isn't a lot of competition. So negotiation was part of it, but I don't think we could drive the kind of bargain we could have driven if we were in a more metropolitan space where there's a lot more competition amongst agents. But where we were, we looked to drive down costs in terms of the decoration. So the decoration, my family members did themselves. So they were quoted £3,500 to do the paintwork in the house. They did that themselves. So they kind of see that as a big win. But there are also other things that they did, like cleaning down the paving. There's a lot of gardening work that needed doing that, you know, all but the gardening work that was, you know, sort of too precarious for family members to do themselves. They did themselves so that they were cutting down those costs. So hopefully they've saved a bit of money that end where they haven't been able to negotiate perhaps what I would have seen as the best deal when it came to the estate agents.
I did, like you suggested, as much of the stuff myself, decorating. I mean, I don't like decorating, but for the means of trying to sell something, you have to look at what people are going to see when they come in. So you do most of it yourself. And like for me, even a few years before, because we knew we wouldn't stay there, we improved the wall outside. It looked terrible. It was falling down when we bought it, but it was stayed like that for a decade. And you thought, well, if at some point we're going to move, someone's going to walk in the front and their first impression is always going to be important. I walked into houses and looked at it and gone immediately, nah, I don't like it. I mean, I've been shown around by the agent, and so I wasn't offending anybody, but it does make a big difference to people's impressions of what the house is like, whether it's bright and airy and things like that, mirrors and all these tricks, which we'll put a link into the show notes, that help improve people's perception of a property. But did you show people round yourself? Because we didn't. I was quite keen, I think, to do it, because I know all the things about the property myself. Getting an agent in to sell your house versus online, I think I get a sense that a lot of people sort of skew towards the online element these days, because they do think agents are expensive, overpriced, and some of them, let's be honest with you, some of their behaviour is probably not that genuine in terms of over promising prices, just get you on, and then they end up downvaluing your property, and actually it's counterproductive because you could end up selling your property for less. But for me, I have to say, getting an agent was a complete success because they ended up getting me more for my house than I would have probably otherwise settled for. And also, they took a lot of the hassle out of the viewings, because they did do some block viewings and they did show people around. I mean, let's be honest, there are some sort of slight issues with that. Things that, in terms of, do people get shown the fact you've just put a new boiler in and all these things you'd probably point out yourself. But I went to see a couple of properties and the seller seemed desperate. And that always starts sending off like spidey senses to me when you go around and the seller's pointing at every tiny thing that's amazing. And we even had one guy tell us the house was in a school catchment area when we knew it wasn't. And so you just sit there thinking, I'm not quite sure about that. So I had a positive experience of an agent. It wasn't all the positive. There were odd gripes. I won't lie. There were points where I was almost, they would drive me up the wall about getting people round, when they were getting people round, sort of offers following up. It's never smooth, but overall I think it's pretty good. Did you show people round, or did you get an agent?
No, it wasn't possible for us to really show people round because we're living at quite a distance from the property. So, just that ruled out being able to do that for ourselves. So the agents have been in charge of all of that. They've shown people around. But also, I think to some extent, when people come around to see a house, they're much more likely to ask questions about things that are concerning them when the owners aren't there, because I think people don't like to offend you and people don't like to say things that might put your nose out of joint because you're the owner of the house. So they're quite careful with what they're asking. But I think when it's just the agent, they can be quite honest and they can have a good look at things that they might otherwise not do when you're in the property. But personally as well, in the past, Damien, I've really not enjoyed watching people traipse around my home. So I've not wanted to be in the house when people have viewed my house that I've sold in the past, just because they're in your personal spaces and they're having a little look around. And as much as you prepare yourself for it, it's not a very comfortable experience having strangers in your home, is it?
No, it's not. And I mean, it was funny though. I'm slightly going off piste here, but I've got a cat, Bella, and I talk about her a lot in the office and occasionally on the podcast. But we even had to take her out of the house one day because she's almost become a house cat. She's so old, and she had a habit of using her litter tray just before someone would arrive, and we had to get to the point where we're like, do you know what? She's going to just probably leave a present for somebody that's going to put off a potential buyer. Actually, she was a lucky charm. She did that literally minutes before what the person who ultimately bought our house did turn up, and we had to sort of whisk her and her present and the tray and everything out of the house just before. But yeah, I think you're right. I quite liked not being there this time around. When I viewed lots of houses, I had the experience of being with the agent and with the people who were selling it. I kind of liked being with the people who were selling it if I was really wanting to be critical and ask them something that was quite challenging on a property. Like, let's say it's on a main road, what's it like? Or because you can judge then whether they're telling you the truth or not. Whereas with an agent, the agent won't necessarily know, and they'll just say, oh, I don't know about a potential problem like who lives next door or some stuff like that. Whereas you could get a sense from the person who is actually selling the property. So I think it swings and roundabouts on that one. But the one thing that I do think you get is that you can work an agent quite hard. You've got to be hard on them. People who are estate agents listen to this might not appreciate me saying this, but when you've had people go around your property and then it's the weekend, then you need to be hearing from them on the Monday. Because if people are going to put in offers, they're going to put it in on Monday if they're keen. Or if not, you need to hear about feedback. And I know there are people who've had agents that have been lazy and they just don't hear anything. And you need to have that feedback because you can always then change agents. So they work for you. They're going to get paid a decent amount of money. So I wouldn't worry about being hard on them to make sure they actually earn that money.
On that point, Damien, I think that when we go back to the question of how we selected the agent, I actually went with the agent that pointed out the most amount of things that were wrong in the property that somebody would notice when they walked in. So I felt like he did a thorough job. He walked round the back and he sort of pointed out a gutter pipe that was slightly out of sync, and he sort of said these are the sort of things that people will notice. There was a window that was slightly blown and you could see that it was misting up and it was £50 to fix it. But he made a long list of the things that we should put right in the house to make it attractive for somebody walking in without making it more expensive. There were just little jobs, but I felt like his attention to detail was there, and that's kind of what clinched it for him.
So I think it's time to get Laura on the show, because she's had probably the good, the bad, and the sort of indifferent and ugly to do with selling a house with online agents and offline agents. So we're going to welcome Laura to the show so she can talk through her experience.
So, yeah, I've sold with a normal high street agent a couple of times. I've also, when we moved about 6 years ago now, we chose to go with an online agent. So it's the now defunct eMove. It isn't in business anymore, but it's very similar in structure to the likes of Purple Bricks. And I'd say that there are definite advantages and disadvantages to both online and high street agents. I think generally moving house is quite stressful. The role of the estate agent in those stress levels can be quite high. So what I'd say is I wouldn't say that either experience was entirely perfect, but there were definite good points to each one too. So looking at the online agent option, we decided to go with it largely because of the cost savings, and it did work out significantly cheaper going with that online agent than it has done going with a normal high street agent. We paid the fees up front. I think from memory it was around £1,000, and included within that was a photographer who came round and did the photos, who created the particulars for the house, and also did the floor plan and the EPC. So that was all included within the price, and I think that that's generally standard for the likes of Purple Bricks now. What wasn't included was the actual viewings. So while eMove would arrange the viewings, the property was listed on Rightmove and Zoopla and those usual portals as you'd expect. People would phone up and book the viewings, but we actually had to carry out those viewings ourselves. Luckily, we sold at a real good point in the market. Like, it was a very buoyant market at the time, and we were lucky enough to put it on a Thursday. We had half a dozen viewings on the Saturday, and then we had a couple of offers on the Monday. So actually it was a very smooth process from that end of things. Also, my husband works in sales, so he was more than happy to do the viewings himself, and to actually, I think he quite enjoyed that process of being able to point out things that perhaps a estate agent wouldn't know about, the sort of work we'd done on the property, different selling points that perhaps would be missed by a more general viewing by an estate agent. What I would say, though, was we definitely noticed a difference in terms of the follow-up after we had the offer in place. It's my feeling with the structure of these online agencies that really they're incentivized for you to sign up, but once you get to the point of being under offer and when the sale is going through, they've already got their money. They're not really incentivized in the same way as a high street agent who gets paid out the commission after the property is completed. They haven't got the same incentive to really be pushing that process forward. So it ended up falling a lot to us and also to the high street agent of the property we were buying to really make sure that everything was proceeding. And when we stumbled across a couple of issues with the sale, a few hold-ups, it was really other agents within the chain who ended up taking the load that should have really been borne by our agent. That said, we managed to get it over the line and we made a significant saving which totaled several £1,000s. So overall, it was a positive experience. That said, we're moving again now, and this time we have chosen to go with a high street agent rather than going down the Purple Bricks route. It's a slightly different sale this time. The property is a bit different from the one that we sold before. And with the market being slightly more complicated in terms of a lot of properties being downvalued, a kind of heat in the market that's actually starting to fizzle out a little bit, we wanted the guarantee that we weren't going to have to pay out money up front for an online agent and then lose out on that if the sale didn't end up going ahead. And actually, while at times our estate agent has driven me absolutely mad, what he has managed to do is to get us a higher asking price in the end. He's actually actually managed to increase the offer that was made on our house, which has actually covered the cost of the estate agent fees. So while it hasn't been ideal, and in some ways now that we're reaching completion point and we're suddenly faced with this bill for the estate agent, it would be quite nice had we gone for purple bricks and had a much smaller bill to pay. He has earned that money in lots of ways, and also he's really worked much harder to progress the sale and to chase all levels in the chain to help it actually get to the point of exchange and completion.
So that's really interesting. Like we said at the start of this piece, and the reason we really brought you in is you've seen both sides of that. And where the first time round using the online agent, you felt like the end of the process kind of slipped away and that fell more on you and the other agents in the chain. Now you're seeing the flip side of that, having used the high street agent, where they're helping you to get it over the line where you lost out before. So swings and roundabouts, isn't it? Obviously now you're kind of almost in the position where you're looking at how much you've got to pay them, but I suppose you're accepting that they've kind of earned the money.
Yeah, so in summary, I'd say that neither of them were a perfect option for us. There were problems with both, and now we're faced with a bill for the estate agent. I'm thinking perhaps we've done the wrong thing this time, but perhaps if we'd gone for the online option, we would have regretted that. Who knows? What have your experiences been, Andy? Have you used an online agent, or have you gone down the high street agent route?
Yeah, and so just to finish off this part, really, I'm completely different to all what we've talked about so far in terms of the pod and selling a property. We were in a really lucky position because we were renting our property out to a family friend, someone we knew, and we had a really good relationship with them. So when we realised that we wanted to sell the property, we got in contact with them first of all, because that's the right thing to do, because we would have had to serve notice. And during that conversation, it transpired that she'd been saving up some money. She'd been looking at buying a property. And so we had a conversation. Would you like to buy it from us? And of course, we got advice from people. But the crucial thing is we didn't use an estate agent. We didn't need to. We kind of brokered the deal ourselves. We knew roughly what the property was worth from doing our own investigations. I spoke to other people. She knew what she could afford. And obviously, she got the mortgage in the end. And of course, we needed to use solicitors to get it over the line. But essentially, there was no agents involved. And so the whole process from beginning to end, I think it only took about 2 or 3 months, which in terms of house moving is pretty quick. And everyone was happy in the end. So that was my experience. It was quite a positive experience. Although looking back at what the property's worth now, maybe I should have gone for a little bit more. Okay, so let's move it on to the final part of this house buying, house selling process. And so we need to get it over the line. We want to work towards the exchange and completion. The offer's been accepted. So how do we get it over the line? What's next?
So the next phase is obviously you're going to have to now do your searches and surveys on the property that you want to buy. And the person buying your house, if you're selling one, is going to do the same. So you need to find a solicitor. Now, I'm going to be honest, if you think the agent could be a thorn in your side at the best of times when you're selling a house, the solicitor is likely just as equally make the whole thing collapse. Now, I'm going to put it out there. I had a nightmare with my solicitor, and it was a personal recommendation. In fact, the one caveat I would say is it was a large firm. So the person that I dealt with would not necessarily be the actual person that the other people had dealt with, but they knew the person who was running the firm. And so therefore you thought it would be a decent experience, but it wasn't. And I think if we'd done much more research around reviews and things like that, we probably would have not gone with them. That's the benefit of hindsight. And the thing is that the solicitor we chose had an online portal, and that made it all much easier in terms of uploading documents. And it was a very good system where you could tick off what you had to do, and it meant that we were very much ahead of schedule in what we were having to do for our buyers and for the sellers and everything like that. The problem is the solicitors still have to talk, and I had a relatively small chain, so that was a positive as well. But the people who were buying our house were going to be first-time buyers, and again, as we talked about in the previous podcast, it's part of the whole thing that goes in the round when you're deciding on accepting an offer will be what the chain will be like. So it was going to make life even easier. Our chain wasn't very big because in the end we were effectively buying what would be a probate house. So it should have been simple, but you've got to be prepared for the fact that it won't be. So even though we were doing everything we were supposed to do, the solicitor in terms of communication was atrocious, and trying to get them to communicate about certain things, and the other solicitor, you're always going to have a problem with the weakest link in any chain. And even if your solicitor is amazing, if someone else's isn't, then you're still going to probably be having to fight an uphill battle. But you can only do what you do. So get a recommendation, I would say, from somebody who has used a solicitor personally. Don't necessarily go for a firm that's big. I think my experience, you'd probably go for one that you knew somebody actually knew them personally. But for me, one of the things in the early stages, we wanted to get things moving quickly. So the searches happen. So you pay your solicitor a ridiculous sum of money, a few £100 to do searches. All the information that you're getting when you do searches are things like whether your property is prone to flooding, and that could be surface water or rivers bursting their bank, or it could even be the sea. There's things to do with like radon. There's things to do with planning regulations in terms of people putting applications who live near you. All of this information, in fact, you can find out yourself online. And we found out more by doing our own research online, by going through the portals with your local government and just doing the searches online yourself for free half the time. We found out all the information that the solicitor did through their searches, and they took ages to come back from the solicitor anyway. To do all of that, you're going to probably find out any initial problems straight away. If you're going to get a survey, then you probably want to do it pretty pronto if you want things to happen quickly and you want to move. It gets back to that, do you do a full structural one or do you do a home buyers? And for me, the survey is important, but you have to realise that there is a lot of caveating that goes on in these surveys. They'll tell you everything's wrong with the house, but then tell you it's nothing to do with them, if that makes sense. They'll all point out the tiniest crack in the wall and everything like that. You have to read it and then make an interpretation of what they're saying. And you can ask them, for example, about Japanese knotweed, but then they may put a caveat that they couldn't see the whole garden. All these kind of things. So you get a survey. We didn't do a full structural. We were actually advised by a number of places not to, because if it's an old house or there's a reason why you think it needs a structural survey, it's very expensive, then a full structural might be relevant then, but it could cost you a couple of £1,000. But then a normal sort of home buyer survey will cover a lot of that stuff, and you can pay additional amounts of money to ask them to look at specific things. So when you go around and look at a house, my tip is to do all the stuff yourself. Take somebody else with you who's impartial, who might know a thing or two about property, to go around on a second viewing, and then they might be able to point out a few things that you can say to the surveyor, I want your opinion on X, Y, and Z. And the thing is, you are going to get issues that come up on the survey. Equally, on your own survey, you'll probably get them. You won't necessarily see what's on the survey your buyer gets because they won't show you, but you might hear about it from the questions that they ask. But do be prepared that there will be things on there. You can ask the questions via your solicitor about the different issues that come up, and then you've got to make a judgment call. Now, what we did is that things that came up, we got tradesmen to go in and look at them and make a judgment on what would need to be done to repair it, because then that gives you a negotiation starting point. If there's thousands of pounds worth of work that needs doing, then you might be able to negotiate on the price that you've offered on the house. So that's the first thing. You won't have the experience. The survey won't tell you the price of repairing things. You need to get people in. So you need to be really on it if you want the whole process to go through smoothly. Now, one thing, the valuation of your property that we're selling, so my house that I was selling, often the valuation will be free with a mortgage offer. So you don't have to pay for it separately. Sometimes you will get the case where valuations are being charged as additional. But these days, a lot of the mortgage lenders actually include free valuations, which will save you a bit of money. And my house was downvalued. Now, what I want to do is bring Lauren onto the show, because Lauren has got a typical experience about down valuation. So Lauren was a first-time buyer. The house she was trying to buy was downvalued. So what was your experience from that point onwards, Lauren?
Yeah, so our property was actually downvalued by 5%. So we had a hairy few hours where we were trying to decide what the next steps were. So when we spoke to our mortgage broker, she said that we had two options, to go back to the sellers and say to them that we needed them to accept the down valuation and accept the new property price, or alternatively we could argue the down valuation and appeal it and hope that we could still buy it at the initial asking price. But the major problem that we had was that the lender refused to give us a mortgage on the property for any higher than what it was worth. So we could only get a mortgage for the downvalued price. So we had to go back to the seller and say, if you want us to still buy this property, you will have to accept the down valuation. Otherwise, we can't get a mortgage. And the circumstance that we were in, we wouldn't have the money to be able to fork up the difference by ourselves. So we went back to the sellers and said to them, are you going to accept the down valuation? Because if not, we're going to have to pull out and you'll have to find yourselves another buyer.
So on that, Lauren, why wouldn't your lender have given you the money on a higher value? If you've gone back and they've downvalued it and said, no, actually the house is worth 250, what you're saying, your lender said, look, even if it is valued at 250, we're not going to give you any more. Is that what it was?
Yeah, they said they weren't going to give us any more on that particular property. And I think in that particular environment with COVID, they were worried about house prices dropping. So there was no way that they were going to give us any more money.
So ultimately, Lauren, does that mean that they accepted the lower price?
Yeah, so they accepted the lower price and we were able to continue with purchasing the property at the reduced price, which actually worked out quite well for us because we had offered the initial asking price and we were now, through no fault of our own, paying less for the property. So we were kind of winning at life for a little bit.
Yeah, so to be honest, like you say, it worked in your favour. The seller could have equally just said, well, that's your problem, and then just gone and found the person who could get the mortgage at that rate. But of course, as you're pointing out, this could be a problem that other people might have, because if it's downvalued by one lender, it could be by another. And in an environment that we're in, then there is a lot of downvaluation that was occurring because house prices feel like they're getting slightly ahead of themselves at times. And to kind of reiterate that, on my house was downvalued by 5%. Now, everybody thinks their house is worth what they put on as the asking price. And obviously, I thought it was a bargain at that price that I put it on the market for. And immediately, our buyers actually said they wanted to challenge that valuation because they believed it was worth what it is actually worth. I mean, the prices are still keep going up even now. And this is where, interestingly, from a seller's point of view, having an agent that is really knows the local area and knows the market can come in handy, because our agent put together a case as to why our house was worth what it was. And so you can appeal the decision by the lender. And that's especially in a case where no one's come out to actually view it and value it physically. If they've just done it on a kind of online, which is what happened in my case, no one would come around the house to look at it and go, yeah, the mortgage company's representatives has looked at it and gone, yeah, I've looked at this house. This is definitely worth whatever I put it on the market for. They just did a blanket 5%. And that's kind of, as you said, to give them a bit of leeway for house price movements in case they started to fall. Well, the person came around, viewed it, and then they went, yeah, this is actually worth what the asking price is. And therefore, we got what we needed. And so therefore it kept the dream alive in terms of our move. And obviously our buyers got what they wanted. They got the full mortgage on that asking price that they had put the offer in at. So again, this is one area where you could have an agent, a good agent that actually does help you and keep things going. If I hadn't used an agent, an estate agent, I'd done it online, effectively doing it myself, then I would have to try and do that all myself to get it going through. And of course, the estate agent had already had a similar issue with the same lender on a different property elsewhere. And so they already knew what buttons to press to be able to increase the likelihood that the down valuation would be overturned. So, I mean, it's quite interesting. We've got two sides of the story where you end up getting a down valuation happens and actually it's justified. And then you get a down valuation where you feel it's not, and you can get different outcomes. And so another tip before we move on is that I would suggest you get hold of a checklist of the sort of questions that you get asked by a potential buyer about the house that you're selling. So I'm talking about if you're a seller and you're selling your house, then go and look at what they are. It'll be about things like boundaries. It might be about disputes with neighbours. It might be about the utilities going to the property, all the sorts of things that a new buyer would want to know. Familiarise yourself with those way before you even put your house on your market, to be honest with you, because then you know about any potential issues that are going to come up that you can either rectify or find out the information. So it means that when you have to complete that form, then all things can move forward at a pace. Now, a lot of the exchange to completion stage is about banging heads together, unfortunately, and you end up just getting frustrated with communication levels. But on the survey, I know, for example, Justin had a great surveyor on his property he went round who highlighted and said to him, look, this type of house or property sometimes has asbestos in it. And Justin has said to me, I can tell this story in the podcast, and basically his house that he was going to buy was riddled with asbestos, which isn't actually a problem. I think about 1 in 2 houses do have asbestos in them, as long as it's not disturbed. But he ended up entering a negotiation with the potential seller about that issue and actually had some of that asbestos or all of that asbestos removed, because the person was actually motivated to sell, and because of other circumstances, it was going to make it difficult for them to sell the property anyway. And they really were in a point where Justin was in a position to probably play a slightly stronger hand in terms of negotiation. So you can have wiggle room. You can end up reducing the price, or you can ask them to actually carry out work themselves and provide evidence of that before you actually then go on to exchange. So talking about exchange law, and I mean, your exchange, from the offer to the exchange, was what? How long? How many months?
In total, it's just shy of 8 months, end of January to end of August.
Yeah, so that's a long period of time where lots of things can happen. And so there's always the tip that at the point before you exchange, you should go around and try and view the house again, although the person doesn't have to let you go in again if they don't want to. Or you could at least go drive by and have a look at it and make sure you're quite happy with what's going on. But you had an interesting story, because when you did a drive-by, not a shooting, but like a drive-by in terms of views and all that kind of stuff, looking at what's going on, there was an issue, wasn't there?
Yeah, so when we actually viewed the property, the seller was there, and they told us that they have a parking space which came with the property, but the parking space was in a garage area not too far from the property, and they actually let a neighbour use the parking space because they didn't want to park in it, which was fine. And they said that they would get the neighbour to obviously move, because a condition of us purchasing the property was that we would want to use the parking space. And when we drove past numerous times, we actually noticed that there was a car that seemed like it was dumped there. It actually had tarpaulin over it in the parking space. In the whole 8 months it took to purchase the property, the car did not move. So as the exchange and completion date was actually getting closer, I kept saying to my partner, we need to check this car. This car needs to go. Whose car is this? Has it been dumped? Are we going to move in and exchange on a property and have to deal with someone's dumped vehicle? So we were getting chased to exchange, but I actually contacted our solicitor and I said, the car is still in the parking space and we're not prepared to exchange whilst this neighbour's car is in the parking space, because we do need to use it. And by this point, because the car had been there for so long, I was a bit worried about the neighbour's rights to occupy that particular piece of land, because we weren't sure how long the car had been parked there. So I raised these concerns with my solicitor, and she said that we needed to get the car moved. So there was a lot of to and fro between us and our solicitors and our seller's solicitors. And if I'm honest, I think the seller's solicitors actually thought that the car parking in the space was one that the neighbour was using actively every day. I'm not sure they realised that it was one that was essentially dumped, because it took a long while for them to actually do anything about moving the car.
Because it was on Google Maps. You even went back like a detective, didn't you? And you could see on Google Maps it'd been there for a long time. So ultimately, you ended up getting them to move it and sign a letter, didn't you, to say that they weren't going to try and claim any rights over the car parking space?
Well, I tried to get them to sign a letter, and that got quite difficult in the end. The seller solicitors weren't being very cooperative with that. But eventually they did get the neighbours to move the car, and before we exchanged, we actually drove past the night before into like the garage area, and the car had been removed. But we then had 3 weeks from exchange to completion. We kept driving past to make sure the car hadn't gone back there, because otherwise I was like, we're going to have another problem if they've moved it just for us to exchange and then put it back. But thankfully, once the car had been moved, it hasn't been back since, and we've been able to use the space.
So that's a good example of a story where you just need to still keep an eye on what's going on. One other thing before we finish up on the podcast, one tip is that to get things over the line, sometimes you have to cut out the agents and the solicitors. And I know there'll be people who have done it, and I've done it in the past, where you end up having to speak to people directly if they are happy for you to do that, because sometimes the solicitors and agents can muddy the waters and not pass on information. Where I eventually met the people who I was buying the house from, and they were lovely people, and I so wish we'd met them earlier. And I think the feeling was slightly mutual, because you actually feel sometimes there's this sort of antagonism going on and this distrust in the whole situation that's placed there largely by the solicitors and the agents sometimes, because they're just a means of communication, when it really wasn't, and you probably could have just resolved the situation in a 2-minute conversation. One thing I would say is that a tip of mine is that if you're buying in a chain, and obviously when you go to exchange you have to transfer money, so the money at the bottom, say somebody at the first time buyer will normally have to put like 10% of the property value down, and then that next up the chain they have to put the equivalent of 10% on the next property, but you use the deposit from the person below you in the chain all the way up. And you can have it where you don't have to necessarily put down the full 10% of it, because as you go up the chain, that's a lot of money. You don't have to. You can agree within the chain that, let's say the bottom person puts 10%. As that deposit is moving up the chain, theoretically there is money there that would equate to maybe 5% of the price of the house towards the top. And if all the sisters and the people who are selling their houses agree, that can be sufficient. Or you could get to the case like me, where you get to the night before you're meant to exchange and they drop the bombshell that they haven't actually negotiated that, even though you'd asked them to. I'm talking about my solicitor, that you would suddenly have to transfer funds equivalent to about 5% of the property value overnight if you're going to exchange the next day. Luckily, I knew how useless the solicitors were and sort of had that contingency that I would be able to pull it across at short notice. So always think that someone else is going to mess up this for you. And that even includes the buffer that I talked about earlier on in terms of cash. At last minute, someone might turn around and just say, look, I want X amount of £1,000 off the price for whatever reason. And if you want it to go through, sometimes you have to just suck it up and then move on. So just to wrap that up, then removals, I think, did you move yourself, Andy, or did you get someone else to help you? I had someone help me. They did actually break something of mine, but I was very on it and they sorted that out, a desk. What about you? Did you move yourself?
I did move myself and it was okay. We saved a lot of money by doing so, but my advice would be if you've got the money and the contingency to do it, then definitely use professionals, because there's a reason that people employ people like that. Because I'll be honest, I nearly put myself in hospital.
I'll tell you one thing though, people don't realise, well I didn't realise, I shouldn't say people, it's me, that the level of service you can get now, even for like a very cheap amount of money. I mean, if you shop around, you can get a wide range of quotes. And one of the quotes we got was half of some of the others we got. And they took the beds down and put them back up again on the day. So when you moved in, your bed was already there, ready for you that evening, which makes a big difference when you're tired after moving. And the other thing I would say, obviously box it all, get as many boxes as you can, label everything, which room it's going to go in. And most importantly of all, have a box that is easily accessible, that has the tea and coffee in. Because that is the thing you're going to want when you move in the house. You want to have a cup of tea and a cup of coffee and some of the cleaning stuff. Someone gave us that tip and we appreciate it that much. I feel like I need to pass it on to the rest of the UK.
Okay, so that's it. That's our house buying special over 2 special podcasts. We haven't done it before. Give us your feedback. Tell us whether you enjoyed it, whether it's something you'd like us to do again. So please do head over to our Facebook group. It's facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. And also, if you've loved these last couple of pods, don't forget to check out Lauren's house buying journey, which is up on the YouTube channel. You can follow her right through from when she started saving money, paying off debts, right through to when she exchanged and completed. It's a fascinating journey and it's all up there. So if you want to contact Damien about anything else, of course you can do so. It's Damien at moneytothemasses.com. Twitter, it's at moneytothemasses with number 2. And we're on Instagram and all the usual places. So, Lauren, thanks for coming on. Damien, we're done for this week. Until next time.
Until next time.